Our guest speaker today is Gabe Howard. Gabe is an award-winning speaker, author, and podcast host who lives with bipolar disorder. He hosts the weekly Psych Central podcast and is the co-host of the Not Crazy podcast. He's the author of Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations, and has appeared on numerous websites, podcasts, and in many traditional media outlets. He makes his home in Central Ohio with his wife, and he has also worked with our fabulous Peg. Welcome, Gabe.
Thank you so much, Judy, for having me, and thank all of you for having me. I am envisioning, of course, a worldwide standing ovation and applause. So if that's not what's happening, don't put it in the chat. I would just appreciate to be left alone with my illusions. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Howard, and I live with bipolar disorder and anxiety. And my story starts all the way back in 2003 when I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. But really, it kind of starts before then. See, I thought about suicide as far back as I can remember. And you know, people they challenge me on this. They're like, dude, you thought about suicide when you were 10 years old? And I say, yes, I did. And they're like, well, now wait a minute. You thought about suicide when you were 5 years old? And I say, yes, I did. And then for some reason, probably out of sheer awkwardness, they say, well, now wait a minute. Aha, you thought about suicide when everything was going well and everything was great and you were happy? And I'd say, yes. I would think that today is the day that I'm not going to kill myself. It was just an intrinsic part of the way that my brain worked. It was my personality. And because it was with me from literally the day that I was born, I thought it was just part of the human condition. When I looked around at my parents and my teachers and my peer groups, I assumed that all of them were thinking about suicide as well. I thought that it was perfectly reasonable and normal to weigh the pros and cons of life or death. Life was hard for me. I had issues, and my parents saw the issues. They were blatant, and they tried to punish the symptoms of bipolar disorder out of me. And you know, my story is not going to zag to the left on you. I'm not about to tell you how my father beat me, or how my mother was absent, or how there was abuse in my family. There wasn't. My parents were and are good people. And in fact, the worst thing they really ever did to me was give me a younger brother and sister. This is where I pause for laughter that I no doubt assume is happening virtually. We believed that mental illness was a moral value. We thought it was about ethics. We thought that this happened to other families. We thought that it came from bad parenting and bad upbringing, and we just thought it was an other thing. It came elsewhere. It happened to other people. And as I said, my parents were good people. Get this. We had dinner together as a family. In my parents' mind, they were doing everything right, and their child wouldn't listen. It was a behavioral problem as far as they were concerned. So they did what any good parents would do. They tried to punish the symptoms of bipolar disorder out of me. That's what they did. I was symptomatic, and they would punish me. This made me not like them very much, because I was trying. I wanted to be like my dad. My dad, when I was growing up, was the coolest dad in the world. He drove a semi-truck, an 18-wheeler, 20-ton semi-truck. When he would leap out of the cab, he looked like a superhero. The diesel fume haze, the door swinging open, the bass of the engine. It was amazing. I wanted to be exactly like him. So when he would tell me to do stuff, I would try. I would try desperately. And when I couldn't do it, they would become angrier and angrier and angrier, which would frustrate me. And then the behavior would escalate from drug and alcohol abuse to stealing the family car to just more than I have time to name. And my parents just dealt with it all as best they could. They really thought that it was hormones. It was boys will be boys. It was the teenage years. They just kept making excuses for the obvious mental illness that I was suffering from because they didn't know. They had no idea. And here's one of the most insidious things about bipolar disorder. See, everybody thinks that bipolar disorder is extreme highs and extreme lows, right? It's one or the other. It's right in the name, bipolar. I can see why people think this, the two extremes, but bipolar disorder moves back and forth on a spectrum, right? Which means that, yes, sometimes suicidal depression, and yes, sometimes godlike mania, but it's also very reasonable to be right in the middle, you know, normal, stereotypical, average. You know, that's when you get the good grades. That's when you make your parents happy. And get this, if I cycled into normal in the vicinity of a punishment, that proved to my parents that their method was working. We would learn many, many years later that the reality is had they done absolutely nothing, I would have cycled right into the exact same place, but they didn't know that. I didn't know that, which means next time I became symptomatic, they used that punishment, but they'd ramp up that punishment. And in their mind, it was working. And what's even worse is, remember those middle times? That showed them that I could do it. I could be good if I wanted to. It proved to them that the symptoms were aberrant behavior that they needed to punish. At 18 years old, when I was an adult, I had enough, and I tried to run away from home and drop out of high school. Now my grandmother, she was having none of this, so she moved me from Columbus, Ohio, to a little town in Pennsylvania and sent me to private school, little private Christian school in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and she watched over me. And I always say my grandmother did it, like my grandfather wasn't standing right there helping. He just gets a bad rap, but they took me in and they helped me. They helped stabilize me because, well, frankly, I just had a lot of free time and they didn't have other children. But I was still very sick, and we didn't address the underlying problem. And while I did graduate, it was a house of cards. When I moved out on my own, I just kept getting sick. And now I had a job, which means I had money. Money is dangerous to somebody who is manic. Money is dangerous to somebody who is suicidal. Money is dangerous to somebody who is not in their right mind and doesn't understand consequences. And I just abused myself. And I abused others. By the time I became 25 years old, I had ran off every decent friend that I ever had. My first wife had left me. I was in so much debt, I had to file bankruptcy. I was hanging on by a string. And remember, I thought about suicide every day of my life. And after 25 years of disappointing my parents, of losing my friends, a failed marriage, all of this debt, all of this shame, and just taking stock of my life, I decided that I tried. I tried. I decided that I just wanted to end it. I'd had enough. It was a quarter of a century of suffering. At this point, a woman that I was casually seeing at the time, and I say casually seeing because this is a family show, she recognized the symptoms of mental illness. She recognized the symptoms of suicidality, and strangely enough, she decided to do something about it. She walked right up to me and she looked me in the eyes and she said, "Gabe, "Are you planning on killing yourself?" Well, I got excited. I thought I was going to have help. Remember, I thought that suicide was normal and that everybody was considering it. I didn't think there was anything wrong with this. I was pleased at her asking. It didn't seem unusual to me at all. But she freaked out. And she said, "Oh my God, we have to go to the hospital right now." Well, I looked at her like she was nuts. The hospital? Why would we go to the hospital? I'm not sick. And the panic, it just increased. And she said, "No, we have to go to the emergency room." Well, now I really thought she'd lost it. The emergency room? Listen, the emergency room is where you go when you get in a car accident. The emergency room is where you go when you fall off the roof of your house. The emergency room is where you go when you have a heart attack. The emergency room is not where you go when you make the very reasonable decision to kill yourself. She was smart. She was very smart. And she looked at me and she said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. Why don't we get in the car and drive to the hospital, drive to the emergency room, and we'll ask the doctor if this is where you need to be." She bet me dinner. And the doctor would determine who won the bet. Well, even in my suicidal, delusional, and depressed state, I still had the overwhelming desire to win an argument. We hopped in the car, we drove to the emergency room. Now, I want to be clear here. I wasn't pretty sure I was right. I wasn't 99.9% sure. I was 100% sure that I was right. 100%. I was just as positive that I was right as all of you are, that you are alive and breathing. We walked into the emergency room and we walked up to the intake person, and she said, "This is my friend Gabe. He wants to kill himself." And the woman said, "Well, I need your name and insurance card." Now this did not dissuade me. A young woman walks in with a guy and says he wants to kill himself. You should probably get a name and some ID. Seems very reasonable to me. I get it. So they took down some information and they said, "Okay, we want to move you to a room." Now, a room in this context is 2 thin sheets suspended from the ceiling with a very uncomfortable gurney bed for you to sit on. But I thought, okay, well, this is a little weird that they're taking this time, but it didn't really move the needle that much. I was still 99.9% sure that I was right. That's pretty certain. And I sat there and a social worker came over. She came over and she said, "Hello, Mr. Howard, I understand that you want to kill yourself." And I said, "Yes, yes, I do." And then she started asking me questions, just one question after another. And I was answering them, very, very compliant. I wasn't afraid of hospitals. I didn't have any ill will toward these people, but I noticed that she was holding a clipboard. And on the clipboard was a sheet of paper, and of course on the sheet of paper were the questions that she was asking. Now, how did they know Gabe was coming? How did they know to get these questions? Like, how they didn't know I was coming. Why is it written down? Why aren't they confused as to why I'm here? The social worker left and the attending doctor came in, the ER doctor came in, and he started asking me pretty much the same questions using different words in a different order. And he too had a clipboard and a sheet of paper and a form and a protocol. See, there was a system for this. There was a plan in place for what happens if somebody shows up at the emergency room and says that they're suicidal, which meant she was right. But it really just meant that I was wrong, and that 25 years of thinking was just wrong. That was the last thing I remember about being in the emergency room. The next thing that I remember is waking up in the psychiatric ward. I was trying to sleep, and they have to draw blood, and apparently I'm a hard stick, so they just kept waking me up to poke around at veins that weren't there. And I finally got around to saying, "Where am I?" And they said, "Well, you're in a psychiatric ward." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, you're on suicide watch." And I reflected back to the night before, and I thought, "Oh, okay, this, oh, okay." It's starting to piece together. And I got up and I put on the robe, and I reflected on everything that I knew about psychiatric wards and mental illness. See, this was no problem. Television had prepared me for this. And I went about looking for the ping pong table. And you're thinking, why did I look for a ping pong table? Well, every pop culture representation of a psychiatric hospital, a psychiatric ward, shows the mental patients playing ping pong. This is in every movie. It's in every television show. So I needed to find it so that I could center myself. And I went around the ward, and as I couldn't find it, I became agitated and aggressive. And finally, somebody walked over to me, an orderly, dressed up with the little thing, and they said, "Sir, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm looking for the ping pong table." And they said, "We don't have a ping pong table." And I said, "You have to have a ping pong table." And they said, "We can't have a ping pong table. It's dangerous." I said, "How is a ping pong table dangerous?" I said, "Look, you can't give mental patients ping pong tables, all right? They have paddles, they have balls, they have sharp corners, they have the net that you could use to hang yourself. It's very dangerous to give people who are suicidal a ping pong table." And I said, "No, no, there is supposed to be a ping pong table here." To this day, being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, all the things that happened before, all the things that happened after, with everything that has happened to me, and I've been in severely dark places. The worst thing that has ever happened to me is finding out that psychiatric hospitals do not, in fact, have ping pong tables. Because that meant that everything I knew was wrong. Was wrong. I knew nothing. My family knew nothing. We as the collective had no clue what was going on. There was nothing to fall back on. Couldn't rely on my own brain. I couldn't rely on the brain of the people around me. The last 25 years of my life were what? A lie? I didn't know anymore. It was all lies. I met with the psychiatrist later that day, and he diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, and he said, "Sir, you're a classic representation." And I said, "Okay." Back in 2003, I only knew one person who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. That was a gentleman by the name of Kurt Cobain. Now, for those of you who are under the age of 25, Kurt Cobain is the lead singer of the alternative rock band Nirvana. For those of you who are over the age of 60, Kurt Cobain is the lead singer of the alternative rock band Nirvana. He was rich. He was so rich that the people around him were rich because of him. That's like a really good reason to keep somebody alive, right? He was a once in a lifetime musical talent, world famous, #1 hit, and he died by suicide with the very illness that I was just diagnosed with. I was none of those things. I wasn't rich. I wasn't a once in a lifetime musical talent. Nobody needed me to be rich. Nobody needed me at all. I thought I was dead. I didn't know anybody who survived a mental illness diagnosis. I only knew suffering and tragedy and crisis. And the rest was filled in by stuff that, made me run around a psych hospital looking for a ping pong table. It was so devastatingly lonely. I honestly believed that I had to liquidate all my assets and move into a group home. I didn't think that I would ever work again. I was terrified that I could have hurt my family. Because remember, we believed everything that TV taught us, and all mentally ill people were supposed to be violent, which means it was just luck that I didn't hurt my family. And I had to live with that in a psychiatric hospital, alone. later that day, I would be in a support group, and they would get this out of me, and I would told them these things, and I told them the stuff that I was afraid of, and I told them that I didn't know how to, get into a group home or be institutionalized, or I didn't understand what was going to happen, and they all looked at me, well, frankly, like I was nuts. And they said, "Sir, you don't have to do any of those things. We're going to get you treatment, and we're going to get you help, and you're going to be okay." I was like, well, I didn't have any understanding of that. I'd only known about crisis and suffering, and that little bit of hope was amazing. I was released from the hospital 3 days later, and I like to say, looking back, that began my 4-year epic battle against bipolar disorder. See, from the time I was diagnosed to the time that I reached recovery took 4 years. Now, I define recovery as spending more of my life living my life than I do managing bipolar disorder. The day that I got out of the psychiatric hospital, 100% of my life was spent managing bipolar disorder. And now today it's some lower number, 5%, 10%. See, I'm always going to have to manage bipolar disorder. It's a chronic illness. It's severe and persistent. I'm going to have it my whole life, whether it's just making an appointment, taking my pills, or refilling my pills, or filling out insurance forms. That's always fun. Or monitoring my symptoms. That takes some non-zero amount of time in my life. But the rest of the time, it's mine. I can do with it as I please. I can go on vacation. I can buy a car. I can get a job. I can play with my dog. I can hang out with my wife. Honestly, I mostly spend it watching television, but it's mine to do with as I please. But I just reflected back all the time at all the trouble I had, all the things I didn't know, all the problems that I had. And I thought, man, somebody's got to do something about this. This is horrific. This is awful. I came from a good family, people who were present and loved me, and they didn't know. Somebody needs to tell other families so that this doesn't happen to them. Turns out I'm very loud and big. And I'm lucky. So when I told my parents I wanted to do this, they said, do it. Air the dirty laundry, embarrass the family, do it all. They didn't care. That's so much luck, right? Who has a family that lets them tell all the bad things my parents did? But I still reflect all the way back to the day that I was diagnosed. And I hope that the next person who is diagnosed, when they hear that they have bipolar disorder, instead of thinking about a man who died by suicide because of the bipolar disorder, they think about this loudmouth redhead on the internet. And they think, hey, he has bipolar disorder and he's doing all right. And that's kind of enough. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'm very excited about the Q&A. I know that Judy is going to jump in and moderate. Listen, there are no questions that are off limits. I always hate it when somebody thinks, oh, I don't want to offend him. I don't want to be too personal. Like, I chose to do this for a living. I promise you I am unoffendable. If I do not want to answer the question, I will just politely say, hey, you know what? I'm not comfortable sharing that. No harm, no foul. I just don't want anybody to lose the opportunity to openly discuss a question that they have for fear of, me being offended. That's not what any of this is about. I promise. And believe me, I've been asked some weird questions. So thank you all so much.
Gabe, thank you for sharing your story with us.
You're
I
very
think
welcome.
all of us know someone who has maybe a diagnosable mental illness and maybe self-treating with illicit drugs, with alcohol. At the age of 18, I had a childhood friend that was abusing crack cocaine. And what was amazing to me is that this young man, just like you, grew up in the suburbs, in a loving home, had a mother and a father, had a big brother, had all the things that you would think he would need. So why would he turn to crack cocaine? Unfortunately, he lost the fight with crack cocaine and died 8 years later. And I didn't ask myself then, but I ask myself now, was crack cocaine his issue, or was he self-medicating? And I think that is the question we all must ask ourselves when we know people who are using illicit drugs and alcohol to the point of extremism. Gabe, your story, I think, for this audience is something that we have all lived, either ourselves or a family member or someone we know. That's why we are the NAMI family. How prevalent is the occurrence of substance use disorder and serious mental illness?
I don't have the exact like stats, you know, I'd love to hit you with it's 33% or something like that. But the reality is every investigative body or researcher, they come up with something different for a variety of reasons. I want to be fair that this isn't an issue with science failing us. It's an issue of how you design your study. For example, some studies are if you have any mental illness and you utilize any drug, that's abusing both. Well, we do run into problems with that because not all drugs are the same. Not all, is alcohol self-medicating, but marijuana, or is marijuana self-medicating, but alcohol is not? It gets really, really tough. But a lot of people do, and you can see why. I think if people stopped and thought about it for a moment, you've got a problem with your brain. Now just stop and think about that for a moment. You can't control your brain. One of the things that drugs and alcohol does well is mess up your brain. And that's of course why we want people to avoid it, because we don't want people messing with their brains. Our brains are very, very valuable. But in somebody like me, my brain's messed up. That's all I want to do. I only want to mess with my brain. I want to interrupt it so much. And if I don't have a base understanding of how science works or mental illness, or I believe all the stuff that I saw on television, or I can't get to a doctor for a myriad of reasons, I might believe that, hey, drinking calms my nerves. Sometimes it goes higher. Drinking becomes marijuana, becomes crack cocaine, becomes methamphetamines, becomes heroin, and just who knows. But it's very easy to see how this starts. It's like that little spark, right? It's this idea that there's something wrong with their brain and they're trying to find a way to cope with it. And unfortunately, drugs and alcohol in this country are very easy to get your hands on. And mental health care is harder to get your hands on. So if you're somebody who is struggling and suffering and you've got to make a split-second decision on how to calm the whatever it is in your head, I live in Ohio. You can buy liquor at the grocery store. It's the wrong solution, but it is understandable how people end up here, especially given that a lot of people are young and they don't understand. Well, we just don't understand mental health, period. So it's not surprising that people make the wrong decision. And then finally, then you're hooked. Now you've got two problems. Which drives the other is going to be different for everybody. And it's probably unknowable. And I'm desperately trying not to get on a soapbox. I hate that we separate the two out. Well, was it drugs and alcohol or was it mental illness? Yeah, who cares? All right, Bob has a problem. Let's help Bob. Let's put it all together. Let's stop trying to figure out which one it is. Let's look at the entire person. And while we're at it, it shouldn't be drugs and alcohol and physical health, or mental health and physical health. It should just be health. But that's probably outside the scope of the question.
Not really. Gabe, how can you give us concrete ways that we may know if someone is exhibiting signs and behaviors that may be indicative of either substance abuse or alcoholism? What does that look like?
So when people ask me this question, one of the things that I always say is if you have to ask, right? Like that's kind of enough for me. If you're thinking that way, you may well be right. And the example that I love is my long suffering mother. See, I'm a redhead, in case you can't tell. I don't know if I have good lighting or not, and I'm translucent. I'm translucent. And I'm the only one of my mother's 3 children who you can see through if the sun is bright enough. And everybody told her when I was very young, she's like, okay, he's going to get skin cancer by 7 if you don't put sunblock on him and get him to a dermatologist. Now, we understand this way more now, but keep in mind, this would have been like 1975, 1976, 1977. This sunblock was not as en vogue as it was now, but my mother was buying it from a pharmacy to slap on me. And she really instilled in me that if I see anything weird growing on me, I need to get it checked out immediately, because who knows? Now, I'm now 43 years old, and I got to tell you, in all of the times that I've ever found something weird growing on me and it's been cancer, 1 out of 100. So what, was I wrong about the other 99? Was I wasting the doctor's time? Was I barking up the wrong tree? No, this is celebrated behavior when it comes to dermatology. See something weird, get it checked out. It's in every dermatologist's office in America. But for some reason, when it comes to mental health or substance abuse, we're like, listen, even though you're not a doctor and you have no specialized training, before you suggest that somebody get it checked out by a doctor, you yourself must be 100% sure. And then in the same breath, they also say, don't be an armchair psychologist. You can't diagnose your friends. Which is it? Do we have to be 100% sure, or should we not diagnose our friends? You're losing me here. And this bothers me a lot, because I really do feel like we know our loved ones. We know our friends and our loved ones. And if we're worried about them, get it checked out. What's the worst case scenario, Judy? I tell you that I'm worried about you. I get you to a therapist. We go together. You go for a couple of sessions and it turns out that Gabe was wrong. So what? So what? Once again, when I go to the doctor for the little, weird things, I don't want to be right. I want that freckle to just be a freckle. I certainly don't consider it a waste of time. As far as actual symptoms, listen, there's a lot of them. There really are. They're going to vary by person, but behavioral change is the big one. I could rattle off 1,000 of them, but if your friend is acting differently from the way that they used to behave, better than average odds that there is either drugs, alcohol, or mental illness. I really tell people to focus on the before and the after. If your friend got up every day at 8 o'clock, went to work, was really stable, reliable, and now suddenly they've quit their job, they don't show up at events anymore, they don't answer their phone, they're not replying to texts, that's a pretty good sign that something somewhere has changed. It's not a lock, but that's what I would recommend looking at.
So Gabe, let's take that a little bit further. Now you know that your friend is, let's just say, off, right? Let's air quote it. How do you get that friend to actually go and seek help?
So I'm a real firm believer in the partnership method, the what I call the buddy system. One of the things that I think that people are prone to do, and I want to be clear, I'm not talking about mental health here. I'm not talking about mental health. I'm not talking about mental illness. I'm not talking about drugs and alcohol. Nothing. I'm just talking about people prone to do. People are prone to see their loved ones making a mistake and ordering them to stop it. And we're all guilty of it. We all look at somebody younger who's, getting ready to buy a house, and they decide, oh, the inspection's $600. I'm not going to get that. Now, everybody within the sound of my voice should immediately gasp. You're going to buy a house and not get an inspection over $600? What, are you stupid? And our knee-jerk reaction is to say exactly that. You're getting ready to buy an expensive house that's your biggest investment, and you're not. What is wrong with you? Get the inspection. We all want to do that. And of course, when we do it, the people we say this to, no, I don't need 600. What I can see, they're not going to fix it anyway. They have all these locked and loaded excuses, right? Because there's a reason they made that decision. May not be a good reason, but it's a reason. I really believe in the partnership method. That is a true story of my pseudo kid who did not want to get an inspection on his house. I thought I pretended to raise him better than this. I don't understand. But I pulled him aside and I said, hey, I understand you're thinking of waiving inspection. He's like, yeah, it's $600. I've already looked through the house. I know what to look for. I'm like, okay, well, what do you think would happen if something was broke? Like, could you consider it like an insurance policy? And I asked open-ended questions. We talked it out. And suddenly he's like, oh, Gabe, you're right. I was thinking of it from they wouldn't fix it, so why bother finding it? But I might be willing to not buy the house and I can get out of it. I didn't understand that because, it's his first house. He's young. If I would have went at him hot, he never would have inspected that house. So now apply that to we see our loved ones behaving erratically. And of course, we're emotionally invested, right? It's very emotional for us. We have all of the same, we're traumatized by what's happening to our loved ones. And we just want to yell, stop it, don't do that, do this. It doesn't work. Like I said, forget about the mental illness. It doesn't work. I am a firm believer in offering up the partnership. If you can't convince them to go on their own, meaning you talk to them enough and eventually they come up with the idea on their own and you just, let them have the credit even though it was all you. The last thing that I recommend that people do is the do it for me. Listen, Judy, we've been friends for a long time. I love you. I've known you since college. I am extremely worried. I know you don't want to go, but will you go for me? Can we go together? If you have the means, offer to pay for it. Just to, go to lunch afterwards. Pull out all the stops. Whatever you have to do, make it about you then. Because sometimes people just don't want to go because they honestly believe nothing's wrong. Remember, 100%. I was 100% sure, but she tricked me, and that changed the trajectory of my life. I really believe that that's kind of your final step. The last little piece that I want to add is people come to me and they're like, okay, well, that would have been great to know, but we're in this rut. Like my family member and I have been fighting for the last 5 years about this, so I can't suddenly change up. They're not going to listen to me. And this is when I say, we have to remember that we have to have some humility here. I want to save my child because I love my child, but sometimes you got to tap out. You got to find that favorite aunt. You got to find that sibling. You got to find that grandparent. You got to find somebody that doesn't have this history of headbutting, and give them all the information and ask them to talk to your loved one. My parents did this with me, with my grandparents. I honestly believe that my grandmother just picked me up and saved me. She didn't. My parents were pulling all the strings, all of them. They called my grandmother and said, we need your help. He'll listen to you. He won't listen to us. These were big moments in my life. And I do think that they will work for others on some level. Please, again, be nimble. It doesn't always work. It takes time. And sincerely, don't give up after one try. Whatever situation you're in, you may have been in for a long time. And it's sort of like weight loss. You can't go on a diet for a week and say, oh, it didn't work. It doesn't work that way. It's you got to put in real effort for real time, and hopefully you'll start seeing changes. And also take care of yourself. Do not be afraid to go to therapy for your own trauma related to this. I'm sure I know this is NAMI, so you can't pour from an empty cup. Self-care is advocacy, but it's true.
So Gabe, take us back to those dark days. Take us to your darkest day and tell us, how did you deal with it then compared to how you would deal with it now?
In the darkest days, before diagnosis, before treatment, I convinced myself that not only if I died would nobody miss me. Like that's a really bitter pill to swallow, right? This idea that if you died, nobody would care. But that's not what I convinced myself of. I convinced myself that if I died, people would be happy. I thought that my death was a way to bestow excitement and happiness. And I thought that my family would see this as Christmas morning. They would just be so oh, he's dead. Like I don't know that I can ever explain how it feels to believe that your mother and your father and your grandmother would celebrate your death. They would just be so overjoyed. Those were really, really dark moments. And on top of that, I would have not showered for a week. I would have laid in bed for 3 or 4 days. I'd just be filthy, and I'd feel filthy, and I'd think filthy. Maybe I hadn't been sleeping, or maybe I'd been only sleeping, and then only to be comforted by the thought that the only way you can make your family happy is to die. It's a lot. The way that it's different now is medication for bipolar disorder. It's designed to shorten that emotional range, right? See, like my emotional range before diagnosis was, like I said, suicidal depression all the way to godlike mania. That's literally the entire extreme. There's nothing left. That's not healthy. Nobody should be so depressed that they're contemplating suicide. That's a disorder. But obviously people need to have an emotional range, right? We need to know when to laugh or cry or be happy or be sad or just be bored. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. So the medication is designed to get me into that normal range, right? Is just so that I can experience happiness and I can experience sadness, but that's the goal. Now it'd be perfect if they could just like build a border on either side, and the border was perfect and never shifted or moved or leaked, but it doesn't. The border does shift and leak and move. And the difference now is I am trained at like border maintenance, for lack of a better word. I know what it looks like when it's starting to leak, or when it's starting to shift, or when the dam is about to break. And the goal is to do that maintenance. And some of that maintenance is, going to the doctor on time, filling my prescriptions and taking them as prescribed, making sure that I'm taking the right prescriptions. That's all part of that maintenance. But if it starts to leak a little bit, it's getting on top of it. That way, when I call my doctor, I say, I've been slightly depressed the last week. Okay, that's much easier to work with than Gabe is hiding in the basement closet, is urinating in there because he won't come out, and he keeps yelling, "My grandmother wants me dead." Well, how do you can't even talk to me then. So we want to get ahead of it. Finally, the last thing is I'm very fortunate. I have a real great partnership with a couple of people around me. My best friend and my wife. They are the two that if they say anything, I do it, because they don't abuse the power and they understand it. And we have a really good, we have a really good partnership in managing bipolar disorder. So if my wife came to me and said, "Gabe, I think there's a problem, you need to talk to a doctor," even if I was 100% sure that she was wrong, I would think to myself, you know what? She's got a vantage point that I don't have. She's got a reason for thinking this. We have worked together to figure this out beforehand. I'm going to trust you. And not for nothing, that also makes for a pretty strong marriage as well. I would like to think that it's pretty cool to be married to somebody who is willing to go to the doctor based on you asking them to. I think that shows a level of intimacy and trust. So as you're thinking about like, man, do I want to listen to my best friend if she tells me or he tells me to go to a doctor? I understand that it's probably a pain in the butt, especially if they're wrong, but you are leading by example. And who cares if they're wrong? Who cares? Just who cares? There's worse things.
So Gabe, to say we're living in unprecedented times, and I'm referring to COVID-19 and the pandemic and all of that, right? We won't even get into politics or anything else, but just specifically to COVID-19. How do you think COVID-19 has affected people who have mental illness and co-occurrence of substance use disorder?
Many of my coping skills are now illegal. And I say that a little bit to be funny, but I'm not lying. they're illegal. Concerts are illegal. Sporting events are illegal. Things are just now starting to open up in Ohio, but for 4 months, you couldn't even go sit in a restaurant or a coffee shop. Malls were closed. You want to get out of your own head. You want to get out of your house. One of the things that my therapist taught me literally from like jump was, listen, you can't sit at home and stew. You're getting yourself in a feedback loop. Do anything that you can to break the cycle. Go sit in a coffee shop and people watch. Go mall walk. Go look at furniture that you're never gonna buy. Try on shoes that you don't want. Anything to just get out. Also, this helps me. If I know that I'm leaving, I take a shower. I get dressed. I comb my hair. You know what I mean? Well, that we were literally told to stay home.
Yeah.
And not only were we told to stay home, but everything was canceled. So it's not like I can say, you know, I'm staying home right now, but my wife and I, we've been watching a lot of baseball or hockey or our favorite TV shows or that new movie that came out. All of that was canceled too. So my wife and I are sitting at home watching reruns of King of the Hill, which is a really good show that holds up very well. That was tragic. It was very tragic, and I'm so lucky that I've had things to hold on to, whether it be, you know, I can only imagine having to try to get through this without my wife. You know, she provided me distraction just being in the house. It wasn't always good distraction, but it was distraction. Even being annoyed with somebody is an improvement to being in a corner wishing that you were dead. I mean, as much as I hate to say it, it's a rock and a hard place though, isn't it? Those are the things that I see. And these are the challenges that people are having. I know that it helped a lot of people, including me, when the weather broke. You know, this all kind of started in March and it was cold, and then people could get outside and we could, you know, the park started to open back up and we could go for walks and stuff. Now, I'm not a big walker, but I made it work. Because I just had to do something. People started going for drives. I'm worried about it as we head into winter. What's that going to look like? But yeah, that's the challenge that I see. People are having to relearn coping skills, and I can't stress that enough to people who are not battling mental health issues or mental illness. Coping skills take a long time to find and curate and make habit. And many of us took years to tone them into perfection. And even if we started getting a new coping skill on day one of the pandemic, 9 months is not enough time. And because of so many issues in managing the pandemic, many of us believed that this would be over in a couple of weeks, that it was just a minor inconvenience. So many of us didn't even try to do anything to make our lives better until 2 or 3 months in, which means in the light most favorable to many of us, we've had less than 6 months to try to learn a new coping skills. I only say that because please be patient with us. It may well look like we're not trying, but I assure you we are. The other half of that question is, I think it's very important. You said, you know, what are some things that have hurt elsewhere? I like that the whole world is now talking about mental health. I sincerely do. I am sad though that the conversation is steered almost entirely to mental health. Mental illness mental illness didn't get a lot of, like, severe and persistent mental illness, you know, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. I'm not playing the suffering Olympics, I assure you, but you know that while we do want to talk about mental health more, we're still not doing anything about the homeless population. But we're all patting ourselves on the back a little bit because mental health is more in the news. I am hopeful that that pivots into understanding mental illness more. I think that may well be a silver lining, but we're not there yet. People are very excited to talk about anxiety and low-grade depression, but they're still very, very scared of suicidality, schizophrenia, and psychosis. I do hope it pivots. I hope things change. I hope that this is a good jumping off point. And that's where advocates like us and groups like NAMI have to be really aware of, you know, talking about mental health doesn't mean they have the whole picture, right? It's like only listening to rock music and say that you understand music. oh, there's so much more, but I'm really excited that you have discovered music. Now let's expand that out.
Well, Gabe, it has been great chatting with you this afternoon. I just have two more questions for you before Gary closes us out. How has working with NAMI been helpful to you? And then if you could just share with us any special projects you have coming up.
So I have such a great NAMI story, and I know that it's not an original NAMI story. It's just great because it's mine, I guess. I lived in Columbus, Ohio when I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and my family lived in Memphis, Tennessee, which is roughly 660 miles away. So my family gets this phone call. Yeah, go Bucks. Hey. My family gets this phone call that says, hey, your oldest son, who you thought was doing well, because remember, I just lied out my ass to him. I was just like, oh yeah, I bought a house, everything's going fine. They get this phone call that says your child, your oldest child, is in a psychiatric hospital. And they immediately freaked out and thought they needed to send a lawyer because I had been arrested. And so that was like a real struggle, their misunderstanding of what was actually happening. They really thought that I was facing criminal charges, or that it was like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is what they're imagining 700 miles away, 650 miles away. So they're freaking out. I can't comfort them because I'm in a psychiatric ward. I got things going on. I'm trying to find the ping pong table, for Pete's sake. And then I keep calling them 5-6 times a day, crying because I don't know what's going on. And I have their number memorized. That's honestly the reason that I called my mother, is because I had her number memorized. That's it. That's the only reason. And she's trying to help me by saying all the wrong things, which would just scare me even more. And that's our mess. That's the start of our mental health journey. My mother, she realizes that the whole family's freaking out. So she calls a therapist in Memphis, Tennessee, and says, hey, my son was just diagnosed with bipolar disorder. We don't know what to do. Can you help us? The therapist says, you need to call NAMI. My mom said, okay, what is that? She said, it's NAMI. That's what it is. I don't know what to tell you. Come in, pick up a pamphlet on bipolar disorder and a pamphlet on NAMI. So my mother drove to the local therapist's office, and those were the 2 pamphlets she got. The first thing that she told me is she read the bipolar pamphlet and said, oh my God, I always called you my Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde child, so they clearly diagnosed you correctly. Like, I'm so glad you could figure this out later and not maybe ahead of time, but that's fine. And then she read the thing for NAMI. Now, go back into 2003, she called NAMI and they told her that she needed to take a family and friends class, which is what family to family is. And they did. They all took family to family, and suddenly they had real information. Not only do they have real information, but they're in a room with other people who are freaked out. So they don't feel so alone. And they're in a room with peer support. Remember, not family to family is taught by loved ones and family members who have gone through this and are just in a different stage in the journey. So all of that working together was just an amazing moment for my family on learning about this. And when I reached recovery, and now I didn't know anything about this. Just 4 years went by. I'm sure they mentioned it. I just didn't really commit it to memory. But my mom in a phone call said, NAMI stands for National Alliance on Mental Illness. National means they probably have one in Columbus. All right, I'd never thought about that before, so I Yahooed it. Like, this is how long ago we're talking. I'm very old. I went onto Yahoo and I typed in National Alliance on Mental Illness. I found NAMI, Ohio, and the rest, as they say, is history. I was the walk manager for a while. I served on the NAMI Ohio Board of Directors. I was on the Consumer Council for NAMI National. I've just done so much for NAMI over the years, and I don't know where it fits in my advocacy style, but this really was my first major advocacy. It was all with NAMI, and that's excellent training. I wonder who I would be if I had to invent the wheel all by myself, because I don't have funding to do my own research. Like, NAMI gave me the research because y'all have, the funding to get the right information. I took the family to family class. I took peer-to-peer. I was a connections facilitator. I did In Our Own Voice. I did the walk. I love the walk. So yeah, so those are great memories and great moments.
So
There was
any
another
special
question in
project
there.
coming up?
Oh yeah, the projects. Thank you so much. So every Tuesday, let me see if I can find cool stickers. Hang on a second. Normally I hand them out, but pandemic. Every Tuesday on your favorite podcast player, the Not Crazy podcast is released. You can go to psychcentral.com/notcrazy. Now that is a lived experience podcast. I always say that it's for people with mental health issues by people with mental health issues. So it's pop culture-ish, right? It's how we feel as people living with mental illness or mental health challenges about the things that we see. Like, for example, one of the episodes was, okay, the Joker movie. Is this helpful? Is this harmful? Where does it land? And we discussed it for better, for worse. So it's social commentary, but through the lens of people living with mental illness. And then I have the Psych Central podcast. Ta-da! Psych Central podcast available on your favorite podcast player or by going to psychcentral.com/show. The Psych Central podcast was the first podcast I ever started. And literally, what I wanted to do was have experts explain things to my dad. I can't be more clear on that. My father, he's now a retired truck driver. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and I'm not saying any of that to be mean to them in any way. I'm just saying that one day their son was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and they started looking for information, and they couldn't understand it. My parents didn't want bad information. They wanted it from doctors, and the doctors, it shot right over their head. They had no idea what was going on, but they desperately needed this information. So my whole goal is to find doctors, literally people from Harvard, Johns Hopkins. I had the guy from the National Institute of Mental Health on, the lead medical director. And my whole goal is to get them to explain things in a way that my father can understand. Because if my father can understand it, anybody can. And I believe that this bridges the gap between, can we trust the information and can we understand the information? Because reliable information that people don't understand, it's pointless. And unfortunately, unreliable information is often very easy to understand because it's not reliant on fact or truth or reality. So the Psych Central podcast, it's my baby. I'm so proud of it. I explain high-end mental illness, mental health, and psychology concepts to lay people. And I feature just some of the most incredible doctors, researchers, social workers in the country. And I've learned so much from it, and I'm super proud of it. Those are the two things. Of course, the book is ongoing. I used to say that I had all these speaking engagements coming up, but COVID stole my public speaking career. I don't know what else to say. Of course, you can always grab the book. I don't know if I'm allowed to show it or not. Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations. You can see it's like really thick. It's awesome. I'll sign it. I'll include a bunch of stickers. Hang on, I got to hold it this way. I forgot. There you go. It's a very, very cool book. It's written pretty much in the exact same voice that I'm using now. So if you can't stand my cadence, don't buy the book. But if you like it.
Is there an Audible?
There is not. There is not. I need to make one.
You got to make one.
I keep saying I don't have time, but we all know that's a lie.
Dave, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.